So yeah, we can start debate under the motion of video games. I'll call upon the Prime Minister to start the debate here.
I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Ladies and gentlemen, we understand that the idea of video games are now trending in the status quo, right? It means that opposition cannot say that this is something that is not feasible, because recently, even the United States military, for example, has utilized video games to recruit people to get into the military and colony of armies, ladies and gentlemen. Because with video games, for example, this is what increases attraction upon something, right? Making people, for example, for wanting to participate in that particular field. US military, for example, even hire a Twitch streamer for this, and this is the hype and also the type of investment that we also want under our side of the house in terms of educational sector, right? Making it as our significant educational tool, right? If you don't believe US military actually utilizing this strategy, for example, utilizing video games, I think that you should believe me, because that's the method that Bushai gives to me, right? So the problem with education, ladies and gentlemen, this is not something that everyone enjoys, although it should become the most important part in someone's life, right? So even if, for example, we understand that education is the most important part of someone's life, but this is not something that is not necessarily enjoyable for everyone or even attractive for everyone. Not something because of noting that, something that because sometimes you are just forced into that because externalities, for example, force them to participate in that educational sector, right? Because when you participate because of externalities, we think that the absorption of educations might not necessarily be effective under your side of the house, right? Especially when our youth, I think that this is the framing that is very important for you to take, has been habituated and also have been convenient with the idea of digitalization, and them being habituated with gaming settings, for example, when they would like to learn about strategy, when they would like to learn about a strategy and also any kind of methodological approach, for example, and so on and so forth. I think that our youth, for example, have been habituated with this kind of way, right? I think that this is something that we want to invest in under our side of the house. No, thank you. So there are several things that I would like to tell you. Number one, I'm going to talk about conventional schools and why attractions is very important at the end of the day. But before that, let's go to several mechanisms, right, to mechanize how our work will look like. Look, under our side of the house, we think that these video games will be our entry point for people to learn or wanting to learn, ladies and gentlemen, because games and its attractions is more universal rather than the fun in school, ladies and gentlemen. Not everyone, for example, necessarily enjoys the fun in school, right? But more people, I think that will be able to relate, for example, and find enjoyment within the games, for example, right? Under our side of the house, we are going to utilize, for example, Animal Crossing and also Harvest Moon to allow our people to learn farming, which obviously will be according to the standard of curriculum set by the government. Or maybe we use The Sims to allow individuals to learn about social interactions and so on and so forth, right? But second mechanism, how is our form of investment will look like under our side of the house, right? For we think that for every all teachers or lecturers that currently exist in the current status quo, we think that is okay for them to teach in conventional way. But for new teachers who are relatively young, or new teachers who are, for example, opting in these current educational institutions, we are going to teach them to operate these video games and invest our financial capacity, for example, to allow and also equip these young teachers, for example, so that they will be able to operate these video games as our educational tools at the end of the day, right? So my argumentation why this is good in the very first place, later. Number one, let's talk about attractions, right? We are not merely talking about the benefit of digitalization, but an exclusive feature of video games and why this is good, ladies and gentlemen. Because we think that this is an exclusive way for you to be able to make people understand about certain knowledge and increase their understanding effectively, ladies and gentlemen. Because in some games, for example, they require basic understanding for you to possess in order for you to win certain strategical game, right? Games require you to have certain understandings or certain basic knowledge. We are talking about puzzle, for example, that require you you to have at least basic methodical approach to solve certain problems, right? We say that the reason why this is more effective, ladies and gentlemen, because what you need to understand is that the spectrums of students that exist in educational institution, right? Not all students, for example, can shout and yell in the class and say whatever they want, and can lead the group project at the end of the day, right? Making the participation in the class, for example, only make the extrovert students to become the beneficiary of it. But at the very least, under our side of the house, when everyone focus on their gaming strategy, for example, I think that we are not in a class settings where everyone pressure up and we are more likely to be silent when we are an introvert kids, ladies and gentlemen. But under our side of the house, we have more control. We can be able to be more participative within these video games whenever these video games become our educational tools at the end of the day, right? I think that this is something that is good, that allow accessibility for everyone to participate in the class fairly, ladies and gentlemen, right? So this is the reason why everyone will have an equal chance, for example, to allow themselves to learn strategy on how to have a good farming and so on and so forth, right? But we also think that we can literally have gaming influencers, right? Because especially these game influencers in the current status quo has also increased a lot of popularity. It means that we are going to have a huge platforms, particularly for young people, the stakeholders that we focus on in the current status quo. They're in the current status quo that increases the attractions of these video games at the end of the day, right? If team opposition come to the stage by saying that there will be no interaction that exists and interaction is important in educational institution, we think that when gaming become our educational tool, ladies and gentlemen, I think that the idea of interaction also exists. This is like what happened, for example, exists in an application like Duolingo, for example, that always reminding us and always remind us of the progress that we have made, right? We think that the conventional educational tool is highly contingent on whether or not the teachers, for example, will possess this capacity to always remind your progress. The problem is that this is not something that is accessible for everyone, because teachers, for example, have their favorite kids. There is favoritism within a certain class and so on and so forth, right? No one will, for example, constantly remind you how far have you progressed out of this education and so on and so forth, right? This exists under our side of the house, right? Because of these video games, for example, will not possess favoritism under our side of the house, ladies and gentlemen. So note, to preempt opposition, we think that they are not able to simply push the burden to government, saying that what is going to be the benefit, that it is not going to be accessible because every people will need electronical devices in order to possess this educational whenever it comes in the form of video gaming, right? I think that is where the word heavily investing comes in, ladies and gentlemen, right? We do not necessarily, for example, making tomorrow and also next year to suddenly people are equipped with these video games thingy and so on and so forth, right? But this is something that we want to invest. Maybe the benefit that is going to be experienced in the future years, and this is something that we think that very worth to invest, very proud to stand on team government.
Thank you, PM. Next, LO.
Hi, I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
All right. Oh, wait a second. Dar. All right. My preference methods of POI is through chat box. I will open my chat. If I want to take it, I will take it. But if I don't, I will not take it. So yeah. Anyway, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Look, they said that not everyone enjoy going to school, right? Because we are going to force them to participate in education. Absorption of education will not be maximalized and yada, yada, yada. But the issue is actually there's the reasons why a lot of people did not want to get to educations and they had school, but it's not necessarily because they hate the activity of studying or learning, but most of the times because they feel alienated with what kind of issues that are being taught by the school itself, right? No one exactly know. Even I back then did not even know why I learned algebra or even geometry. I still don't know what's the purposes of me learning that. And the constant alienations between the subject and also the individuals who become the subject of learning makes me question that this might be not the issue is not where or not the learning process is actually fun, but how really profitable is this issue with my life, and whether or not I will utilize it later in the future. This type of methods and approach inside of this kind of education is something that are specifically applied in other countries such as Nordics or any other places that specifically make sure that the idea of education itself is not something that alienate people. It includes individuals in the end of the day, right? It shows you that it's not an apple to apple solutions, not to mention when we try to heavily invest to this type of gaming but if we apply the same matrices and curriculum itself, it will no longer be useful in the end of the day. But later, I will also explain to you why itself it's actually not a good idea. They said that gaming is good because it encourages you and it makes you have fun and etc. etc. But we don't think that gaming is a very ideal places for you to learn and study, especially if you want to learn something. Why? Because they said that it's a preferred method of teaching. But we think that the best method of teaching is when you are able to tailor the type of learning process each and accordance to every type of student that is existing in that class. The automation of learning itself makes sure that the developer of the game will make an ultimate methods of gaming and try to make sure that every children learn the same way. It could maybe interactive at some extent and have multiple responses in the end of the day. However, though that there might be a multiple responses inside of that game and multiple scenario like how RPGs, Undertale, or whatever the gaming is going on, but I don't think that's exactly still ideal. Why? Because we think that it's kind of impossible for you to learn every single behavior of children. It's different with Carousel School on hand-on approach on these individuals. You will have more likely tendency to understand your children. You will more likely have the ability to understand everyone inside of your classroom or etc. in the end of the day, because you will end up later on trying to adjust any kind of needs of your teacher and studying in accordance to every single individuals that is existing in the end of the day. It actually debunked the idea that this is actually that easy. When they say that there will be a report and progress and everything. I'm so sorry, maybe that you go to school degree or something when the teacher doesn't actually care what's your progress are and etc. Right? But we didn't actually defend that either. We prefer methods that are we going to create much as opposed to investing this amount of money to create gaming. We would rather to create a better education system, better training to the teacher and such. So people will actually take attention and progress to what you're actually going on. That's exactly what monthly report is and give you evaluation. But what's important is not only the evaluation is existing only in numbers, because this is when something that in gaming, right? Gaming try to objectify everything. They will try to make everything will be calculated by numerics, that your progress and everything that you do inside of your game will be ends up being calculated with certain amount of number. For example, your 70% succeed. For our 90% that are progressing the game, you go to level 3 to level 5 because the system thinks that you already undergo several tasks and pass for like 5 or 6 exercise instead of that gaming itself. It's actually bad because it's in the end of the day, it will emphasize the standardizations and numerifications inside of learning process itself. We don't think that this is an ideal methods of learning, because in the end of the day, people will be directly think that, hey, maybe the best methods of learning, if only I can achieve the goal without necessarily thinking about the possible process and possible methods for you to do it. Because I think that the idea of an ideal method of learning is not always whether you are able to have the ability to achieve the target given by your teacher to level up and go up and to level up and beat the bosses or something that it can't that time. Because I think that the ideal methods of learning process is that you also figure of you understanding yourself better. You are least likely because when your hand-on approach, meaning that there will be a significant amount of people and teacher will be reduced significantly if we apply this method, meaning that there will be less resources to do this hand-on approach to every children that are actually being taught in itself, right? Meaning that these children will have to struggle and internalize every single games by their own, and they will have to make sure that whatever going on in itself is they will try to filter it by their own self. It's different when teacher or the one who give this kind of methods of learning or etc. Right? When there's some people who are struggling, teacher usually try to say you maybe this subject is not for you. You're okay not to pursue that much on this metric as long as you still pass the KKM or something like that. This kind of word of encouragement, and teacher are most likely going to give agreement to this, make sure that the idea of numerification will much more less significant. Yes, scoring exists in status quo, but this is not something that we want to continue on, right? This is exactly we support educational system like those in Singapore, when the objective evaluation is less about that, but more upon the margin of progress that you do as a human being, or whether that your idea is actually applicable in real life or extra. We deny any kind of leveling system inside of gaming itself, right? Not to mention, gaming will make you super competitive in the end of the day. We think that in the idea of learning process itself is supposed to be less about competition, but more upon you have the ability to accept the progress that you currently are right now. Why does competition is something that inherent inside of gaming, right? Because you always constantly want to level up. You will know that exactly at what level your friends currently is. Maybe your friends will make fun of you at some degree because you are stuck and cannot shoot anyone inside of the game and become the burden of the team or something like that, right? Maybe the competitive nature itself is inherent to the idea of gaming itself, that you see learning as less upon the methods of you understanding yourself, but rather as something that you should achieve certain degree of target in order for you to survive and to go to pass to another classes, We think that the eliminations of this process and trying to, because you're constantly being pushed to do more. Because if you don't actually push yourself to do more, you will least likely incentivize to do it. We think something that is counterproductive in the idea of education, that in education, failing is something that always justified in the end of the day, right? Because it's about the ability for you to evaluate your learning mechanism or etc. In the end of the day, we don't necessarily have to be super competitive about it. Not to mention that super realistic video game is not good, especially if it's made by government, because most likely than not, there's several biases that are maybe inserted inside of that particular game. We think that based on these two justification points, gaming sucks. We don't want people to addicted to mathematics game or something. Back to us.
Thank you, LO. Next, DPM.
Preferred gender pronoun is nothing, so you can call me anything you want. My preferred method of receiving POI is via chat. So please do not unmute yourself. That said, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to talk about two things in my speech. One, I'm going to talk about what is the current education problem that makes it not accessible, and why do we think that this motion is not a problem-solution mismatch. Number two, I'm going to talk about how will the world look like if we heavily invest in this, why the trade-off is worth it. Like, I'm going to explain the mechanics explanation and process analysis as well. So first, let's talk about what is the current problem. So basically, their claim on this is that the problem is not about people not interested in education, but people are not interested in like the specific subjects because they don't feel like it is meaningful for them. For example, Devi apparently does not like algebra. What we posit under government is that the target of our policy right now, which is Generation Z and younger, have a fundamental problem of being opposed to the very concept of conventional education as a whole, regardless of the concept. And the structural reason as to why it is the case has been explained by Randy previously in his speech, but I'm going to add 3 more structural reasons to this. One, note that Generation Z and younger lives in the internet. They grew up in the internet, and in the internet, especially on their bubble, there is a very, very strong narrative that conventional education is boomer stuffs. And there is a very strong narrative that everything boomer-esque is something that is not cool and you should not engage to that. Like, this is proven, like, you know, like for example, Nicole will make a video making fun of boomer with her okay boomer video. Like, people will literally like basically opposed to anything that is conventional in nature, right? So like, that's the first structural reason. The second structural reason is that given that these people grew up in technology, they are psychologically accustomed to visual engaging stuffs, and conventional learning is not visual engaging. You do not see colorful videos, you do not see moving objects that are very good to look at. All you see is book, and it is very boring and it's very tiring to read. Video games on the comparative is much more exciting. Like, it excites you, it increases your adrenaline and so on, which means that the tendency of people to be gravitated towards video games is much, much bigger in comparison to conventional education. Number 3, note that in those people's circles, there is a very strong narrative that gamer is something that is necessary for you to be successful. They see like streamers like Myth, like Shroud, like Pokimane, simply playing games and them simply being successful. And since there is no counter narrative to say that those are simply very rare circumstances, people do not be exposed to counter narrative, which means to say that these 3 structural reasons shows that for the specific demographics that we are targeting right now, it is very, very problematic in terms of the concept of education in and of itself, and not about the relatability of issues. But even if we talk about relatability of issues, we argue that opposition seems to generalize all games as to inherently involve competition, inherently involve like inherently involve things like leveling and so on and so forth. We don't think so. Gaming is universal in nature. There is a game that teaches you about sociology, such as, for example, Sims 4. It doesn't have any competition at all. Minecraft, for example, that is very, very sandbox in nature. People can literally build a 16-bit computer inside a Minecraft server. Ladies and gentlemen, that goes on to show how open-ended the gaming world is. If you want to talk about mathematics stuff, for example, we can also have like coding games, which are also visually engaging, but teaches basic concepts of coding as well. All of this goes on to show that the first clash goes to us thus far. Before I move on, yes, Basri.
Okay, first, the reason why game become very interested because it serves as an alternative. How do you think it will stay interested if it becomes the rules number? Ya udah itu aja.
Okay, which leads me nicely to my second thing about what's the comparative. How will the world look like? Why is it going to be successful? I'm going to bring you a real life case study of PogChamp chess tournament. 10 years ago, chess is perceived as a boomer sport. It is a very ancient sport and is only played by people who are 60 years old. But with the rise of Queen's Gambit and with the rise of Twitch streamers playing chess, chess.com made an initiative to create PogChamp chess tournament. It downgrades chess. Like the play is not as sophisticated as actual pro play, and some traditional pro players perceives it as an insult to the art of chess itself. But as a consequence, the popularity of chess exploded to the extent that a lot of people are willing to genuinely learn chess that goes beyond all of the fun and funny commentaries and like stupid moves that happens in the PogChamp tournament itself. Chess is sustainable until today with a constant 30K viewers on Twitch, and this is exactly the thing that we envision at our side of the house. We simply want to expand this concept towards conventional education. What are the structural reasons then? I have three things to say here. Number one, in terms of entry, ladies and gentlemen, do note that a lot of streamers actually have ties to conventional education itself. Let's not stigmatize streamers as just this bunch of kids who plays games for a living and do nothing else. A lot of streamers have conventional education backgrounds. Average Jonas, for example, a very famous Valorant streamer, has 3 college degrees. A lot of streamers also take master degrees, but they also take professional gaming as well. What I'm trying to say here is that if we, as the government, tries to reach out to them and say that, guys, I know that you guys are a gamer, but you guys also sympathize to the idea of education, that is exactly the entry point for us to say that these people can also promote the message of conventional education. And given the context that oftentimes these streamers have a very strong cult of personality, the likelihood of people being interested to conventional education, just like how they're interested in PogChamp, like in the parallel example of chess, it's also likely to happen on our side of the house. But second of all, let's talk about further the transition of people from fun to serious learning, right? Because Devi apparently claims that video games cannot cater to the interests and behaviors of students. We have 2 responses to this. One, no, there is a lot of constant interaction in games, for example, Sim4, in multiplayer games, and so on and so forth. Number 2, note that the comparative that they have is still vague, hands-on approach, like what do they mean? It is not mechanized well. If they bring the example of Singapore and Finland, that is a very specific case because Singapore and Finland have a very, very small population and they are very, very rich. Hence, the ability of government to focus on those specific segment of students is very, very big. That is not the bell curve. We talk about countries like Indonesia or United States, which faces an endemic of people not being interested in education at all. And this is a massive solution that is most visible on our side of the house. So that's the second thing. Number 3, when they claim that game tries to objectify and make competition out of everything, number 1, no, that's not the case. Again, they generalize games. A lot of times, games are very, very open-ended in nature, but yeah, not all of it involves competition. But even if some of it involves competition, do note that some of their harms is not mutually exclusive. They talk about report cards, they talk about leveling, they talk about toxic culture, and so on and so forth. It is inherent in a lot of interaction in the social group, ladies and gentlemen, regardless if you talk about education or not. People want to compare themselves regardless of the system encourage you to do it or not. Hence, it's a problem that is not mutually exclusive, even if the motion does not exist. Very, very proud to propose.
Thank you, DPM. Next, DLO.
My preferred gender pronoun is he or him. POI through chat box, please. Don't unmute yourself until I call your name. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to talk about two things in my speech. First, I'm going to talk about how the game will look like in educational setting and why will that be a very, very bad idea. And two, what is the comparative we want to draw in this debate? But before of that, several things that we need to clear from the get-go, right? Because like from the PM, they want to say that, okay, at the very least, this is a long-term investment, and hence the investment is worth it now because in the future there will be returns, benefits, and so on and so forth. If that's the game they want to play, it's also fair for us to say that we also do not like status quo. We also do not like how education in the status quo is very, very boomer, it's very, very conventional. That sucks. We cannot rebut that. But if the same way they can argue that the way they invest them, therefore benefit, we can also argue that the same level of investment, the same money can come into pedagogy research, for example, can come into funding more good teachers, for example, can come into more basically improving current conventional standards, because basically status quo is currently improving, right? Singapore right now is heavily emphasizing on non-competitive circuit of classes, for example. Therefore, they remove report card, for example. They give encouragements and words. They evaluate words, for example. Or for example, if you look at Indonesia, the worst country in Asia, perhaps, we are actually very, very good, very, very having improvement. Nadim, for example, what do Nadim do? First, he removes UN as main objective of every education and make it to some extent less important and more optional. He fucking put emotional behavior as an assessment towards every individuals. This shows to you that our education in Asia, for example, or in Indonesia or in any country should strive, should progress to a more humanistic approach, to a more holistic approach where individuals are being upholded as they are, where individuals are being assessed as who they are and not as a competitive thing as it is. And I think at that moment in time, this is where gaming becomes problematic, right? 3 reasons. First, look, you cannot just say, look, Minecraft have this, that, right? Because like, if you talk about gaming in educational settings, most likely it will probably be like what, Civilization or Assassin's Creed, where it teaches you history and social science, for example. It most likely be like Monkey Typer or like some coding games that teach you how to do stuff. I think at that moment in time, you cannot just say, oh, it will be like Minecraft. It will be educational without objective. Game in itself encourages you through objectives, through scores, for example, or through list of side quests that are being required, for example. At that moment in time, that is where this is where you put your students, degrade them into scores they generate, into checklist of side quests that they can solve in the game. That's first problem. But second problem, right? Let's talk about how the reason. Okay, let's agree that Randy explicitly said that, okay, game is very fun, it's very engaging, but there are reasons why that game is engaging, because people come to that place, young people come to that place optionally, not being required, not being pushed, not being forced by their schools, for example. The moment your school tells you, okay, we have this game, you need to play this game, that's the moment your game loses its value. That's the moment your game loses its meaning as an escapism that is engaging and becomes very, very methodical and like required thing to do, and younger people will hate this too. Much worse, considering how sucks life is for this younger generation. Literally, they are being they literally being fucked by boomers. Literally, their school sucks and so on and so forth. At that moment, video games are the only channel where they can play, express socialize with their peers without necessarily the burden of having education, without necessarily having the idea that this is just another work to do. In government side of the house, it's extremely evil for them to remove this children's playground, to remove this, to intervene in and come to their only safe haven and tell them that this is now needs to be educational. What have I told you since thus far? I have told you that they will lose their effectiveness, that there will be diminishing returns the moment that they force everyone to play the same game. That is assuming that everyone can play the same game. But two, I have told you that it's inherently evil. And third of all, I'm going to tell you that it will be much more harmful for the children, because right now we don't know for sure what kind of escapism these children will go to, for example. That's it. But let's talk about the comparative, right? The comparative works because right now our problem in Indonesia, for example, this is a good study case because right now the policy are good. Like our assessment in high school are good, but the problem is we need more money to do more research. We need to gather more data. We need to invest to more teachers to be able to succumb to government's demand, for example, to make sure that the teacher can be more humanist, can less. If the government can tell you that the teacher are right now very favoritist, then you invest more younger teacher and you give them proper wage and proper teachings to ensure that they can work. Status quo can work. You don't have to necessarily do this evil thing as to gamify video game. And that is why when they said like, okay, Generation Z anti-boomer and therefore they are anti-education, this is a lie, right? Generation Z hates school because they think it's pointless, because they think like, why the fuck I have to like learn and so on and so forth. And hence our curriculum is on the right track, where we teach you a context on why you need to learn algebra, why we need to learn here and there and there. And if you don't think you fit in that context, it's okay to you to flunk that subject. That's the right trajectory of our education. Their video game idea is very backwards towards this idea, and hence we oppose.
Thank you so much, DLO. Next, government.
POI preferred method is through chat. I'll take one or two. Gender pronouns, anything. I don't have any gender pronouns. Don't have any preferred gender pronouns. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Two clashes of this debate. Number one, I'm going to talk about, I think that this debate has become messy at its core. And I think that I'm going to, do a lot of like tidying into clashes. Number one, I'm going to talk about the idea of education, which is more in line with what the government wants. Number two, I'm going to talk about, I'm going to get mechanistic, and I'm going to talk about benefits and features and etc. Right? Okay. Before that, a very big rebuttal. I think that opposition cannot enter this debate and say that I think that what opposition needs to talk in this debate is that what does it mean by investing more in teachers, and for example, teacher and learning pedagogy, and teacher, for example, trying to make questions or make subjects relatable, right? Because I think that at the end of the day, it's not necessarily the education per se, but I mean like biology is definitely something that is really relatable, right? Or even like algebra has like, for example, questions that are in that are related in real life. But the problem is that we are consistently tells you is that the materials that are being, for example, given in the methods of education that are being given at the end of the day is something that is really like, for example, of course, boomer, and is not as necessarily interesting, like, for example, old textbooks and like papers that are really boring, and you have to, for example, write everything and etc, right? So I think that coming with a breakthrough of technology and giving breakthrough of technology and giving like interactive questions or like giving features such as what like we already explained to you, I think that is something that can, for example, increases the idea of increases the interest of the people, right? So I think that that's something that we need to talk in this debate. So I think that what needs to be talked
what also already been being talked by team government is that right now the bell curve of the society that government wants to, for example, help study are the people who, for example, lost concentration and are being like, for example, pressured to do like, for example, online school and quizzes and etc etc. That actually mainly is because, like, for example, the method of the teaching is very much it's only like, you know, one way interaction, and it's not interactive, or there are no games, or there are no nothing to actually keeps the student alive and wanting to actually learn, right? And comparatively under our side, we already told you that socially video games are more colorful, more interesting, a lot of subjects that are explainable to graphics, for example. This helps because right now the momentum is that we are studying online, and there are, for example, a lot of study aesthetics such as study blur, studygram, and all of those things that we actually write notes in our iPad that can, for example, insert photos and insert videos, for example, because that is the characterization of Gen Z. And like with the high exposure of Twitch, we think that when we are very much familiar with the way that technology works, and we are familiarized with video and technology works, when we go back to, for example, exams that we have to write in, like, for example, traditional black pants, we think that it's much seem education as, like, for example, something that is less cool and something that is less attractive for people. So I think that is something that needs to be talked by opposition. But I think that the biggest problem in opposition is that under their side, there are no mechanistics at all. So it's very much general, saying that you need to improve pedagogy, you have to give encouragement to teacher, increase people's salary. The problem is that when they talk about Nadim also encourages the gamification, right? Nadim also encourages right now the, for example, explaining through, like, for example, video games. So right now also in colleges there are a lot of methods in, like, quiz is and etc etc. So those are the things that are already, it's already in line with what the government want, and in principle we think that it's much more suitable for the Gen Z that are right now, that are really easily distracted and easily demotivated because they have to switch methods and switch traditional methods, right? So opposition needs to really crystallize what do they mean by, like, increased pedagogy, because that like sounds very much very common and very unspecific. So because of that, I think the alternative in opposition was absent. Therefore, a explanation on video games under government is much higher than their side of the house, because they cannot say that we don't like boomers way, we don't like old people's way, and then come with an alternative that is very vague and very hazy, right? Number two, talking about, like, practicality, I'm gonna engage in Andre's point, right? Number one, they said that they see games as escapism. Right now, at the end of the day, they will be stressful when they go to games because, like, yeah, I'm not really sure why, because yeah, it was not explained that much. Number one, we already told to you that POG champs chess tournament, at the end of the day, they don't really play chess well, but it's fun and it increases people's interest, and so people wants to, for example, transition it into something that is really serious, right? That's number one. But number two, even when the method is, like, quote unquote video game, the difference between, like, learning and difference between, like, you playing with your friends is something that is very much different, right? Because at the end of the day, you playing with your friends, and a lot of games in Steam requires you to, for example, just do things that are menial, like go to war or shoot people or etc, right? In comparison with, for example, learning, a lot of the times it's much more serious because there are materials that are being explained. So I think that at the end of the day, people won't necessarily be stressed because they don't have a rough transition from, for example, being accustomed to these features and then having to, for example, switch into, like, for example, writing exams on papers or compiling notes that are very much different, right? In comparison to us, because you don't necessarily have that harsh, that rough transition. At the end of the day, is much better. But number two, we already told to you a lot of things, and to summarize, we think that in current set, in what we actually propose, a lot of things. This also engages Andre's point, right? Talking about people will be degraded into scores and etc. I think this is a very simplistic rebuttal and simplistic attack towards us. Number one, if initially under our world right now, we need to score people, and we need to, for example, make people fill in report cards for the betterment of the people, for example, because of selection into like universities, etc., etc. Then we are going to still keep it, right? But if the, like, for example, we are not necessarily going to switch like the competitive or like uncompetitive, but if there are, like, for example, like lectures that does not necessarily need you to score them, or the scores needs to be personal, then we are going to do that. What we are going to do is only a transition from, like, for example, a very traditional method into like video games, and into something that you can compile, and into something that you can, for example, you compile, and you can watch back, right? So it's making people easier, and yeah, at the end of the day, we're very proud to propose.
Thank you, Government Web.
In 3, 2, 1. Kushay, I'm so sorry for this, right? But like, if you feel offended with this speech, feel free to approach me. But I know you would. But judges, don't get gaslighted by the word mechanization, by the word we don't mechanize. Because factually speaking, we have enough. We have portrayed to you what kind of ideal version of education, what kind of ideal investment on education should be. We have portrayed to you the humanistic approach through investments towards teachers that are more hands-on. From the get-go, Devi has portrayed to you this. Only Devi does not use the word mechanization and structural reasons. I think you cannot just discredit those portrayal and discredit those analysis on the idea of hands-on approach, on improvement of pedagogy, on how we want to create a holistic approach where your score matters less as much as what you learn in schools, for example. I think those portrayals are enough, right? So put that aside, you have mechanism versus mechanism. You have portrayal versus portrayal. You have portrayal of how games in education setting would look like versus how education in our world would look like, especially as Randy set this up, the debate as a future investment, our future return of investment. Then it's also fair for us to shit on status quo, on how status quo sucks, but we say status quo is improving. This is Mbak Novel 101, that you don't have to defend status quo. You can say status quo is improving, and then the debate becomes a policy versus policy comparative. Then you do that. You compare the policy, because under our side of the house, nobody attacks our policy. Nobody says our policy is bad beyond saying status quo is boomer. Then for status quo is bad, we attack their policy. We say that their policy is degrading towards individual. We say their policy is dangerous for children, for not having their safe haven anymore, for not having their escapism anymore. The moment video games becomes a tool of schools propaganda, basically. I think we have put lots of reasons on why. One, their mechanism is not effective, because like the moment this becomes a required subject, because basically when you are required to play Minecraft by your school to do certain objects, to create certain projects, for example, Minecraft will no longer be interesting for you. Minecraft will only be interesting when you literally have the freedom for yourself, the escapism, the enjoyment that you are not in school anymore. Chess is also fun because it's not in school. The moment it becomes in school, the moment it's required for you to do something just to like graduate or and so on and so forth, it becomes no fun lah. So like that's one. We have told you that from the get-go. But two, we have told you that if their policy is effective, it also is dangerous and it also is harmful. We have told you several reasons on this. We have told you on how there are dangers of like degrading individuals, on how we create another layer of competitiveness all over what the world has been competitive with. Why make it more competitive? We have told you on how it backlashes the purpose of education in itself. I think at that moment, compare that to their responses towards us. I think they kind of strawman-ish, because like nobody really tackles our idea on like ideal education, future education, and so on and so forth. Like I think they kind of strawman us and they kind of attack on the bad part of us. I think they don't, if they cannot handle our worst, I think they do not deserve our best, and that is why opposition I think can lah win this debate lah. Okay, we are our UGM derivative, like please give us the win over the ITB derivative lah.
For UGM reply next to ITB reply.
I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Okay, I'm trying to have an experimental structure as reply. Hopefully it went well. So if I am to judge this debate, I will probably have two main questions to the opposition side of the house. One is, one of their main problem is relatability of education. Why is video games is not mutual exclusive in terms of increasing relatability? Number two, and this is the most important, and I'm going to focus on this one, is how will the world look like specifically under their side? Because I understand that Andre and Devi and Basri have talked a lot about quote-unquote proper teaching, quote-unquote hands-on approach, quote-unquote no competition, and quote-unquote teaching relatability. But there are two problems here. Number one, it needs to be fully depicted as to how will the culture be like, how will the interaction between student and teachers be like, and like what is going to be the mindset and the activities done by the student in and of itself. And I feel like that is a very big burden that unfortunately they have not sufficiently depicted. So I don't think that those points can be taken at face value. But second, even if it is taken, do note that their solution seems to talk about the culture of education, right? To make it more relatable and so on and so forth. But the problems that we specifically identified to you is that the platform of education right now is very, very problematic, ladies and gentlemen, regardless of how far in the future they go, because we agree that opposition can also shit on the status quo, but regardless of how much the future they go, the problem of conventional education being not visually engaging still exists. And this is something that me, Randy, and Kin have stated. And number two, the problem of conventional education existing on a distinguished circle in comparison to like gamer, streamer, Twitch circle, which is, by the way, the vast majority of Gen Z resides there. This is the framing that our team have already explicitly stated is still going to happen, which means that even if I'm going to be generous and assume that their culture shift happens, the ability for people to be interested or even to be able to fully understand the importance of education is still going to be very, very small under their side of the house. There needs to be made distinction here between the cultural solution that they provide and the platform problem that we specifically identify under the opening government. Regardless of how good the culture they have under their side, if the platform is unideal, then they cannot win this debate, and we should win instead. They talk about SG and Finland. This is not a bell curve. I have stated to you this earlier. Okay, but then the question becomes, how is the platform under our side is going to be good? We have told you two things. Number one, we talk about the specifically entry point, right? We talk about a lot of Twitch streamers are oftentimes intertwined as well with conventional education on how they are able to cooperate with us and spread their message because they have a very strong cult following of Generation Z, never responded under their side. We also talked about how the chess parallel competition of PogChamp, it was also understood. The question of how will you make people interested in education in the first place platform-wise has not been answered by the opposition side of the house, and this is a very very big blunder that they made under their side of the house. So entry-wise, we win this debate, but then the question becomes on transition, right? Because this is the very big point that opposition bring, which unfortunately, by the way, come out in Basri, so like it's kind of late, but anyway, which is the idea that games will be stressful. It will be perceived as something that's very competitive, and like it will just be like a debater who wants to debate casually but ended up being stressful about it. We told you two things here. Number one, we told you that constant interaction between students and teachers and students is going to exist. And given the context that, again, the problem is the platform and not the culture, their solution can also happen on our side of the house as well. But second of all, we tell you that oftentimes games does not have leveling. It does not have like ranking systems and so on and so forth. Minecraft does not have leveling. You literally just place blocks, but you can build a 16-bit computer of it, ladies and gentlemen. What I'm trying to say here is that opposition seems to generalize games as just competition and so on, but games exist on the two features that we government have identified, but on the specific subject, it is very open-ended. It is very accessible for everyone. So in the context of the output, more people are going to enter education. We're so proud to propose.